welcome back into the theatre. And I would now like to invite each of the group representatives to share with us what they were talking about. And in the time that you were outside, what they were actually debating was, can we stage the scenario? And if we staged this scenario, would we censor it in any way? So Eugene, you have the space.
Actually, we had two questions. The first question was, what are your personal limits towards this scenario? Which we have renamed Daddy Issues. We named three things that we thought were sort of complicated. First, that essentially the father in the story has had non-consensual incest by the end of this thing. He is actually unaware that it's his daughter that whacked him off, right? And we don't know how he would feel about it if he knew it was his daughter who was beating him off. We wonder why the daughter doesn't hire a sex worker. And also that there was this sort of like really overarching question, which the scenario assumes, and that is that there is inherently a power imbalance. That for the domestic worker, the only possible recourse to being asked to perform a sex act is to run away, and not to sort of speak to her employer and say, hi, this happened, what do you want to do about it? Which you would hopefully be able to do in almost any other employment situation. We thought it'd be interesting if, for example, the daughter was a lesbian. You asked for complicating issues, so we give you complicating issues. We also thought it'd be interesting if, it was somehow revealed that the daughter was. Oh, sorry, I didn't think that the domestic worker could have a sex life. We also wondered about what it would look like if the daughter was somehow in a survivor of sex abuse, or if she was growing up, she was vaguely Oedipal. We think the scene should be staged 100% without being censored. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugene. Can I invite Fiza to come on stage? Can it be staged? Can it be staged? Will it?
So our team also mainly had the same points as Eugene's team, Eugene's group. Mainly that the hints of incest may be quite confronting to the audience, and in that sense, but we also agree that art in itself should give people the opportunity to confront things that they don't usually confront in daily life, and that this particular scenario will give rise to many important discussions like the elderly and their sexual lives, whether technology can play a part in helping the elderly with all their daily needs, and all those sort of things. So I think within our team at least, we do agree that it should be staged fully without censorship, but perhaps there should be some warning in the beginning for those who are perhaps not ready for this kind of content. Thank you.
Thank you. Thomas?
Hello. Okay, so for my team, we're talking about the personal limits, and it was quite a consensus, I think, when it was the sexual act that was our personal limit. There was also a discussant who brought up the idea of outsourcing. To fulfill the wants and needs of the elderly. So yeah, the concept of outsourcing. So on the second question, whether or not such a scenario should be staged, yes, it was quite a consensus that it should be allowed to be staged. However, so I think one of the things that were brought up, one of the discussants brought up, that it is easier to talk about things like that when it is in a fictional context. So you don't have to go up to your dad and say, hey dad, about the masturbation thing, right? You can talk about, hey dad, about the character in the story who wanted to have that happen to him. So it provides us with that safe space. There were, however, concerns, although it was a consensus where it was going to be allowed to be staged. There were concerns about representation on whether or not this should be the sole representation of aging in Singapore. And what the content of, say, if this was a play, should it only just be about this, or should it have, or should we insist on having a representation of other facets of aging in Singapore? We were divided on that. So some of us felt that, yes, it could be just this scenario that is presented, but through this one scenario, I think it is just beyond beyond us imagining that we might go through this scenario, and it is also about us interacting with this performance and thinking about our own ethics, morals, values, and all these belief systems that we have. Yeah, that's what I think we have agreed on.
Thank you, Thomas. Meeting.
Hi. So my group, there were 5 of us, and one of us happens to work with in elder care. And I'm not going to say who or what, but basically 3 out of 5 of us decided that we would not jack our fathers off. And it's a relationship that we are not ready as personally to have with our parents. It's a relationship that we could possibly have with, let's say you age with your partner and your partner asks you to do that, we might do that, but it's not something we're ready to confront with our parents. But if it was a question about love, so one of our members did ask if love was a factor, if you didn't do this action and it meant that you didn't love your parent as much as you should. We kind of discussed the other possibilities, like, for example, as Eugene and Thomas had brought up, hiring a sex worker or figuring out something else, I don't know. And perhaps if it was purely masturbation, it's still a gray area, but when we started discussing whether it crossed the line from masturbation into actual intercourse, some of us who were on the maybe yes camp, they kind of went into the I don't know and I'm not so sure camp. So I think there are a lot of subtle things that then takes me to answering the second question. We were kind of unanimously okay to showing it. Because it's a question of much more than just elderly sexuality. Even if it is about elderly sexuality, we need to talk about it. And all of us are for it because the humanity of the scenario needs to be shown. The fact that older people, and especially people with dementia, as one of my group members was sharing, when your inhibitions fall as you sort of progress in dementia, progress seems like a really bad word to use here, but yes, your inhibitions fall, and therefore you kind of start to explore these things a little bit more. Don't quote me, I'm just trying to. But we also think that, so that needs to be shown. People need to see that. And the last thing I think we discussed was that artists have strategies and can engage different ways of delicately presenting this. Delicate is a very, very delicate word. And there are possibilities for us to shift the focus away from sexuality, away from the sex act itself, away from, the fact that he's old, whatever. You can find different ways of doing it. And I think if all those possibilities are there, I think it's really up to the artists to kind of figure out how to present it. So no censorship, yes, let's do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Li Ting. Ainsley.
Okay, some stats. There were 6 of us. 2 people felt they were uncomfortable with the content, mainly because of the incest taboo. The rest of us 4 were okay with the content. In terms of the staging, 1 person said, don't stage it. The other 5 were okay with it, but with age restrictions. Now, the interesting thing compared to everyone else was that we also talked about the modality of the staging. How would it be shown? 2 were okay with, some kind of symbolic representation of what was going on, and 2 of us were okay with full on just show everything. So those are the stats. In terms of the discussion, we did have quite a bit of questioning about whether this was provocation for provocation's sake. Everyone had this idea of, do you use a sex worker? Do you use a dildo? Something to aid the process along that doesn't require your actual hand, right? So you already have that idea of fulfilling what your dad wants, but do you really have to use such a personal solution? But then it also led to this other question about how much merit is there in this play if you take out that last part. We thought there still was. The other interesting thing that we felt was worthwhile saying was that to focus on the father. I mean, I think before this, we've been talking about people who are old as people, but here we've got an old person who's actually asking for something not very savory. And it's a worthwhile thing to say. Yes, it's a natural act and everything, but basically he's asking someone else to jack him off, right? And it was worthwhile to portray that and to explore it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ainsley. Camille?
So there were a couple things that we discussed as a group. The first was that there was sympathy and pity for the act, but the line itself was drawn on incest. And within the group, one of the things that we brought up is that there was no issue if, say, a friend shared it with us, and we'd be okay and we'd support that act if a friend had to share it with us as this is something I had to do. Now, one of the underlying issues that we spoke about was it seemed to be a systemic issue of desire for interaction from the father, and that the daughter has the option of either masturbating a father or not. And how did it get to such a reductive state where it's either this or not? I brought up the point of a film called The Sessions. I don't know if anyone's ever seen The Sessions. Anyone? No? No one's ever seen The Sessions? Jeez. All right.
One person over there.
One person? Thank you. It's a fantastic film. And it highlights that there are actually professionals who aren't necessarily prostitutes who provide such services for people. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a prostitute who does provide this service. Now, within the idea of should this be staged, we looked at it from two lenses, content and context. And from a content level, we agreed on it being two issues, the issue of incest and the issue of it being transactional. And from a context level, we agreed on approximately 2 words to sum up what this act represented. And these are some of the words. It fulfills a dying need, it's familial obligation, it's performing service, it's serving the needs of the elderly, no choice, providing satisfaction, and reluctant responsibility. Now, within the idea of arts and the staging of it, we agreed as a group it shouldn't be arts for art's sake, but sometimes provocation is necessary. And that as a group we agreed simulation is okay, depiction is okay, but the full frontal obscene act, not okay. And the reason why it's not okay is because that sheer extremity of it then prevents the exact thing of what we were doing as a group, which is the discussion of. And the whole idea of using imagination as the best prop to then prompt that sort of conversation and thought the moment you leave the theater, so then you're asking yourself, was that necessary and why, rather than what's for lunch? Beyond that, I personally shared with the group that for me the arts is designed specifically to comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. And so in summary, should this be staged? Yes. Precisely so that we can have conversation about this, so that we can have contrarian thought about this, so we can have collaboration, hey, let's do something like this, so we can have confusion about is this right, is this wrong, and so that we can have actual contact with people, so that we can talk about things and people and places that we don't normally want to talk about, that we want to hide under the carpet and pretend don't exist in this country, let alone in this world. Thank you.
Hiya. Okay, so from the last group, I think a lot of things have been said already. We discovered very early on in our discussions that we all had quite a similar opinion. We were very okay with it. In fact, one of the group members described it as quite sweet, really. As to the question of putting this on stage, no problem at all. And we didn't think we'd have a problem with this happening in real life or in our lives either, but we really tried to push ourselves. So I think we really had a conversation about trying to push what is the personal limit, because we started with no, there is no limit. So it did come down to, I'm really fine if somebody else does it and I'll really support them, but if I had to do this for my father myself, maybe that's kind of difficult. And then for me, I started to think about, well, should then we consider that taking care of sexual needs should be a standard part of care of the elderly? Should it be an obligation? And at that point, I'm not sure I'm saying no, but I'm definitely saying, whoa. But we really appreciated that in having to look for those limits, trying to find a conversation to push those limits, we were getting into more complexity in our understanding of it rather than staying at, oh, that's sweet. There was a discussion between a couple of our group members about how the daughter's use of the blindfold could have been a way for her to preserve her father's dignity. So on pushing the limits, I think I won't go into what we thought about who were the elephants not in the room, what Sasi urged us to think about last night, that there's a lot of people who aren't in this room and who aren't in this discussion, what might they think? I think people have kind of gone through what would generally offend people, but we decided to think about how this scenario and this, if it was staged, could push the limits even further, how it could be even more offensive, potentially. So in a very graphic and visual staging of the act, if this was, we did have a discussion about whether it's more provocative, whether it's the daughter or not the daughter. For example, in the play Dementia that we saw the video clip of earlier, if it was the nurse. So are you looking at a family relationship or professional relationship? Is it more difficult if you're looking at actors versus in a real relationship? What if they're actors who are a father and a daughter for real? What if this is forum theatre? What if the genders were reversed? What if it was an elderly mother asking her son to do this for her? What if it was a father and a son? What if it was a daughter and a mother? So that was our stretching. Thanks.
Wow. I know a lot of you have not spoken tonight, and now I am giving you an opportunity to speak. Would any of the discussants like to respond to what you've just heard before I open it to the floor?
Oh, okay, it's on now. Yeah. So I belong to the group with the lady with the blue hair. We had no limits, but I think in the discussion, what was interesting, we thought we had no limits in the sense of the direct depiction of the scene, right? But in the discussion, we realized the scene was clever and beautiful because it was an effective vehicle to unpack so many other things. Right? I mean, of course, the obvious thing about the sexual needs of the elderly, why would she not have used a sex worker or professional outsource? Was it an act of love? Was it an act of dignity? And staging the play alone, I think we felt also that it needed to have this discussion around it. I think if people were just to watch it and you poll them individually and they go away. Each of us, when we came to our own discussion, while we said, yeah, we were not offended by it, but our not offended by it because we were liberals. And we read the scene literally also. But only in the discussion did we start to unpack it and then realize, oh, actually, it has so much other layer. Right, so I was relating a story. Say, I remember reading this a long time ago of a terminally ill child. Say a girl says, "I want to lose my virginity before I die." Right now, that's not very different from having an elderly man say, "Please jack me off." Right, where do you draw that limit as well? Right, and I think it creates a very nice space, whether to this piece of art. But the discussion needs to happen to realize that actually it's so layered.
Thank you.
Something that actually really stuck out to me was the fact that the father wasn't able to express his need to his daughter. And I think that in our group we had a bit of a discussion on why this is so. Why does he feel ashamed to express this need? Have we become a society where because you're old, you're not allowed to feel that you need you have sexual needs? And I think someone said that one of the doctors said that in real life, if this happens, they give pills to suppress sexual urges. And our question was, why would you do that if a 20-year-old said that, he had sexual needs, you wouldn't give him pills and say, please just, not think about it. Why do we apply the same standard to people who are elderly? And this is a comment that I had earlier as well. I think that we have, in our society, my view is that we don't know how to grow old. I don't know if this is a culture thing that we've just been taught to work, and then after we retire, what do we do with our lives? So I think that there seems to be this break that when you're up to a certain age, you're allowed to do and have all these interests and sexual needs, but then after a certain age, you're just not, and then, what happens?
What happens? Yeah. Thanks. Chloe, are you on the verge of anything?
I think the context was a little bit trivial. One thing that we did talk about was that was this topic chosen because of the impact it would make rather than the context? And I think maybe it would unpack other underlying issues within elderly, more substantial issues. So maybe it is required for there to have such an impact before we release the more contextual issues within elderly work.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for raising that, Olivia.
Yes. Okay, I'm not actually going to respond to what my group shared, but my response. Sorry, Eugene. My response actually is to Camille's sharing about his group sharing about the portrayal of this scene, actually. I mean, and we talked about, mostly it seemed that the discussants were quite open to sharing, to performing this, staging this scene without censorship or whatever. But then I think they raised an interesting point about how graphic the scene needs to be. Because are we being graphic just to court controversy and then to stir that kind of crisis for us to then talk about it? Or do we want to, stage it in such a way where, it is enough as a provocation, but not to the extent where, it's graphic, it's pornographic in that way. So I think that was an interesting POV to consider.
Thank you. 319, you have spoken, Eugene.
I think,
but the others first, and then you.
I think what I find, what I appreciate from this scene is that it really exposes the power relations between the characters. So what was mentioned earlier on was that, would you be more comfortable if this were an older woman with her son, or would you be more comfortable if this were an older man with his daughter? And the same can be said, would you be more comfortable with the domestic worker masturbating the father rather than the daughter masturbating the father? So if you make certain choices, I think it's important to think about why did you make this choice? If you're more comfortable with it being an older man and the daughter, then you got to ask yourself why. Is it certain preconceived notions you have about women and their role in society? Is it certain preconceived notion about certain races doing jobs as a domestic worker in society? And I think it's very important to question power relations, and that's why I do appreciate this scene very much.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Before you, Lily, can we
raise a quick point? Thank you. So actually, one of the things that I was thinking about this scene, of course, I'm all for the fact that, it shouldn't be just provocation for provocation's sake. But I also felt like the reason why this sort of scene was chosen was to really get that non-consensual element really in our face, because, you know, to see the parallel and to understand that in this context where there is an elderly individual involved, it really gets us to see how little agency elderly people have in making their own decisions, making their demands heard. And to some extent, it's because we deprive them of that agency that we have to, you know, shroud everything in silence. Why the daughter has to take up, you know, an uncomfortable, reluctant responsibility, as one of you said, that, you know, it's sort of a two-way street, that the more we deprive them of the agency to make their demands heard, the more we actually place burden on ourselves. You know, we have to bridge the gap. We have to, you know, communicate that, you know, you do have agency, you need to have consensus. Considering this wouldn't be, you know, appropriate in any other scene, considering that it's, you know, non-consensual. I felt like that's really, the element of agency really stuck out to me, how we deprive, you know, elderly people of that.
Oh, thank you. Lily.
Okay, so as the elderly person in this group here, I just want to say that now that I've heard everybody, and I've actually agreed with everybody and all that's said, I don't think this has anything to do with aging. This is the scenarios that were the second half of our symposium here is very much, I saw it as an art piece. And it should be staged and it should be a play. But I now have it much clearer in my mind that I don't think whatever that is being presented here as a play necessarily needs to be a didactic piece. It doesn't need to teach anybody about aging. And I think this is the minefield that we're sort of getting in. It's like, is this representative of aging or not? And I didn't, now that I've had a good think about it, this is really, it doesn't have to be a piece that teaches the audience about aging. And actually, as an aging person, I would be quite concerned that this is how aging is discussed.
Okay, maybe can I say something? Yeah. As an aging person, actually not so old, as a slightly older person than the majority of the people in the hall, I didn't see this as I like that elder sexuality is portrayed because elder sexuality is totally repressed. So I like that part, but I didn't see it as a piece about sexuality. It's actually about love. It's, for me, so portraying it is so powerful because we then, as audience or as people watching this piece, you know, we are asked to think how deep can a love be that a daughter can, you know, attempt to fulfill her father's last wishes. So for me, it's much, much bigger than about sexuality or aging. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Lian.
Yeah, so I think during the discussion, it's very interesting how some people say that for porn, anything goes, but for live theatre, for example, you need to have barriers. And to me, that's ridiculous because young people can access all kinds of porn and there's no guidance whatsoever. So, yeah, to stage it in theatre or film, you know, at least there is a chance for discussion, there's transparency, you know, the director can come and talk about it, actresses and actors can talk about it, and there's value there. But I also agree that art does not necessarily need to have value. It could be just my personal expression, what I think is important. And yeah, so and we were also talking about externalities. What is good art and bad art? You know, does provocative mean that there's no value, it's shock value? And then I was like, okay, I acknowledge that people have different comfort levels, but does that mean that you deprive someone of watching something that is uncomfortable to yourself? Wouldn't it be more effective if, you know, say, so someone raised the example of if I see an obscene act in public, I will immediately talk to my child about it and educate him or her, you know. So why not do the same for theatre? So I'm a bit confused about, you know, whether the advisory means that I can bring a younger child in and then explain things to the child, like in Australia, or you know, you actually have to check IC and say, okay, people of this age can't go in and see it and have contact with this idea. Yeah, so I am personally very liberal, and I would allow people to watch it and talk about it. So yeah, it's about access and having access to uncomfortable ideas, and whether you should bar that access to other people who might find this valuable. Yeah.
Thank you, Leanne. I know the audience has stayed for a very long time, and I think we would like to hear from the audience as well. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to respond to what the discussants are saying? Can we get a microphone to the lady with the red scarf?
Thank you. Hello. For those who think that this scene is just about masturbation, I strongly disagree. I think that as an elderly or the young virgin girl who wants to lose her virginity before dying, I think it's about desiring a human love and contact. So if I were the elderly father and I found out that my daughter did my chore and like jacked me off, I would be even more depressed after than I was before. That's my one point. And I think someone else also brought up the point about why romantic love is not possible for elderly or the disabled. Both my grandfathers had girlfriends who I'm sure loved them because they were too old. So I see this as not just masturbation but love, and I don't see that the daughter doing it is out of love, but like more like a chore, and that's why I would be more depressed as a father knowing that she did this chore for me than that she loved me enough to talk to me as a person and respect why I feel this way.
Thank you. Is there anyone else in the audience that would like to make a comment? Because if you don't want to speak, the discussants are dying to. Sorry, Isha.
I'm just thinking about what would happen if we heard that a play like this is being staged tomorrow by a director that we've never heard of, and by writers and actors, and I think that a lot of us would have that, would feel this sense of irritation, like, oh, they, especially if the production was bad, if it was done badly, because we still do have this feeling that, when we're fighting for, well, even if we want all things to be possible, even if we want theatre to be liberal, we still feel like it has to be done strategically. We would end up vomiting up the old arguments about, oh, this isn't really, this doesn't portray aging in a proper way. It's just for shock value. And I'm just wondering about, it just makes me think about how it's difficult living in an illiberal society, in an illiberal with illiberal laws, to actually embrace in something completely liberal for in actual fact. Like for example, like as much as a lot of us may have the whole idea of like, do we defend Amos Yee's freedom of speech even though he's a shithead? It's that like, yeah, because he's not strategic.
Is there anyone else who would like to respond?
I like very much the comment about love, about the elderly person who was speaking before, because for me, this piece, theater piece, is, I see it being art like a metaphor, so not only like related to the masturbation or sexual problems, but more like a situation that can happen also, for example, if your father or your mother ask you for helping to end the life in a dignified way. So euthanasia, for example. I mean, it's all related to things that can push you to the uncomfortable zone of your ethical limits and cultural limits. And so for me, art is powerful because can go even above the specific problem and be seen at a meta level to more broader issues.
Thank you. And we have a young man in the last row.
Hi. Actually, the whole point of this staging thing is to let the public talk about the issues that is being brought up, right? But actually, after staging it, how many people will really talk about it? Which I do not think people will talk about it after leaving the theater or whatever lah. So yeah, that's just one point that, yeah, it's always a taboo that like nobody dares to talk about. Like it stays within the four walls. That's what I feel. Thanks.
Thank you. And in this block over here. Ladies first.
You know, I'm relating to the earlier discussion. Okay, and we talked about aging and looking after a person's medical needs, their physical needs, emotional needs. And you know, until I read this, I never thought about the sexual needs of aging, of an aging person. So with that in mind, I think there is value in it, simply because it's surfacing something, at least to me, that I've not thought about. And also the comment earlier about how then do you deal with homosexuality in aging people? How then do you work with that? So I think that's all valuable in surfacing it for discussion. So staging it is definitely one way of doing it.
Thank you.
The choice, I mean, obviously there are different possibilities. And the choice of the father and the daughter, I mean, that is only one possibility, you know. And we've since discovered that there's an NGO that provides these services. So obviously, this is not, it's only something I don't know. There's obviously something that other people already know about, and the needs are already being addressed. So it's something that would be good for better knowledge, and then the ability then, I think, to address it properly. But in terms of how it's to be staged, I think it should be done elegantly. It should not be a porn.
Thank you. And the gentleman.
Yeah, I think the play is about many things, as have been pointed out by different people. But for me, I feel like the play is also about deception, I guess, in the sense that the daughter had to blindfold the father before the act was committed. So I feel like there's a bit of deception in there. So I guess what that made me think is what would you do when talking or pointing out like how problematic the scene is not an option. It's like, for example, I'm pretty sure the grandfather wouldn't want to hear about like the power imbalances, you know, that he's bringing up, right, in requesting like the domestic worker for that kind of service, right? Yeah. So I guess what I'm thinking about is, what would you do when talking or communicating is just not an option, right? Given the circumstances, what would you do when the difference cannot be bridged, and you have to make a decision there and then? Yeah, that's my thought.
Thank you. What would we do indeed? I know, is that you waving your pedal? So you will have the last comment because we will show the changes in the polling.
Great, thank you. So I have a problem with the artist having to make you think. That is great that we can do that. I'm an artist. And I don't give a fuck if you decide to grapple with the issue or not. Because art provokes, yes. But at the same time, art creates. Art bonds, provokes, makes you uncomfortable. So I'm a bit uncomfortable whenever art becomes propaganda or becomes didactic. And I would love to see this staged, but not for the sake of bringing things out of elderly care. Yes, maybe as an artist at that point, I might want to explore that, but at the same time, I feel it's a problem when art is used for something because that results in censorship. If that makes you uncomfortable that I decide to put elderly porn on stage, maybe that's something that we need to address. So if I don't want to do it elegantly, it is also my artistic choice, and hopefully we'll be able to offer something interesting to talk about. That'll be great, but it is not my responsibility. It is civic and government responsibility to engage that in a way. Thank you.
And we will now, we have, if it's tweet length.
Hello. Okay, I'm just going to raise the proverbial elephant in the room, as Sasi has mentioned yesterday. What about celibacy? I mean, is there no room, space for the value of celibacy? I mean, all of us have sexual urges, but we are more human beings, more than just your own sexual urges. There's celibacy. There are many instances. If you're married, what if the wife is still around? What if the father, there's wife, but the wife is incapable of servicing him? I mean, celibacy, we all live with it, And I also know of people who are married and the wife is in coma, the wife is brain aneurysm and is not able to function. Does that give the right, therefore, for the person with sexual desire to ask to be serviced? Is there going to be any discussion on celibacy? That's all.
I think you can be as celibate as you want to be, or not. Sure.
One sentence.
You can be as celibate as you want to be or not, but but celibacy is the status quo right now. Let's just be very clear about it. We assume that people are celibate unless they're married and everybody else is deviant and gross. I'm quite happy being deviant and gross, but I'm usually celibate too.
And this makes a very interesting segue into the results of our poll. So what did the audience think before and after our heated exchanges?
Okay, I just wanted, I'm here just to help with the reading of the poll, because yesterday there were some difficulties in reading them. So I've been tasked to make the reading. Okay, but what we've come up with, I don't really need to read, because we've come up with a strategy for you to see the results quite clearly. But today is slightly very different in terms of the way the shifts happen. We took the two polls, the first blind poll and the second poll, was really to see if deliberation, discussion, healthy discussion in a room like this could shift patterns of responses to a survey. More needs to be done in terms of analyzing it and unpacking each and individual codes and each and individual data that we collate. But just for now, we'll show you what your polls have revealed. Moving on. Unlike yesterday night, this time we're able to put texts next to the graphs. And these texts you can read for yourselves. In fact, with the decrease in the respondents, it's even more significant. Thank you. Moving on to the next slide. People started having significant disagreement after the session, and this is to do with the question, it is more important to respond to the medical needs only, yeah? Because what the commentators have generated a thought, something for you to think about between medical needs, physical needs, and now even sexual needs was something that was not raised in the discussion earlier. Next slide. Is it more important to respond to the emotional needs of an elderly? Varied opinions rose, neutrality decreased. If you notice, there's not much shift in other areas, but we wanted to highlight that the neutral sector reduced.
Moving on. Sorry? Yes, of course. The difference came from the other side, the strongly disagree. Moving down. This is now the next slide? Yeah. The strongly agree rose. But again, what we've done with the two forms is that we have these numbers that we've asked all of you to code, and these numbers also is something that we are wanting to pursue later. How many individuals shift individually to, and in what way did they shift? And there's so many other ways to analyze this data, but currently we don't have that much time. So we're just giving you the superficial shifts. So the only question we're asking ourselves is, are there shifts? The meaning of care in artistic space. And these are the three questions we asked yesterday as well, but slightly different for tonight. More people agreed. Shift to strongly agreed. I can't even see my eyesight, my God. I need specs. Okay. As long as informed context, the agreement, significant agreement throughout, less or no disagreement. As in, actually, this one has got not much of a movement. They all remain constantly the same at the start and even after. There's slight significant movements, but they're not significant enough. They're not slight movement, they're not significant enough. That's what I meant. The disagreement decreased significantly after the first session. And more agree and strongly agree increased, right? The blue patterns on the far right. Yeah, and they move to the right because of the agreement. There's a greater agree and strongly agree, and the disagree reduced. Art is a space to encounter personal discomforts, and that shift showed. More agree to that, having art as a space to encounter personal discomfort. So we are still mining this, but this is just the first draft of what we've got from your surveys, even though there's an attrition of 10. Yeah? Which is not very much, you know, it's not. 10 is not very significant. Moving down. Oh, thank you. That's it.
And the evening has not ended. Just like last night, I would like to invite Sasi, the co-founder and director of ITI, the Intercultural Institute, to deliver our closing coda. Sasi.
Let me state at the outset that any appearance of age is greatly exaggerated. Homo sum humani nihil emere alienium puto. I am a human being. I consider nothing that is human alien to me. This is a quote that's attributed to Publius Tentius Afer. In English, he is known as Terence, a playwright of the Roman era. He wrote 170 years before the birth of Christ. And he wrote mostly comedies. And I cite him because I think sometimes the registers of art are incapable of truly capturing what it is to age. Because in the whole discussion today, we discussed what it is to age, what it is to grow old, what it means for a nation to grow old, what it costs, how we might ameliorate it, how we might take care of the aged. But the question that was never asked or never talked about is the fact that aging is about death. That ultimately, it is about that final question. about dying. And how do we want to die? How does dying become meaningful? Is there any meaning in death at all? Can we somehow, somewhere, try to make the death of the ones we love meaningful to them and to ourselves? And I think this is a question that is fundamentally personal, inescapably personal. I am moved by Tan Hao's scenario, and the question seemed to be about incest, about the taboo of incest and the limit to which we will allow such an action to be depicted on stage or not. But really, it is much more basic. It is about the need to touch. It is about the need to accept that there is an erotic side to our lives. Not necessarily just sexual, but erotic. And that this erotic side is fundamental to the other fundamental thing about being human, which is that we need other human beings. We need relationships. Everything that we know about life, everything that we have heard or we have studied or we understand indicates that there is just one constant about happiness in life. It's not about money, it's not about status, it's not about the color of your skin, it's not about ideology, but it's about relationships. The kind of relationships that we can build and how we might conceive them to be meaningful and significant, and how we might think that they may be important, not about how we would die, important in considering how we have lived. I don't think it just needs to be about masturbation. My sister and I looked after our parents in their last years, in their final years. And anyone who has given care to people you love will understand that it is never just a question about giving, it is also a question about taking. Because in those final stages of life, when you give care, when you touch, when you put on lotion, when you comb hair, when you shave, you develop a dimension of intimacy that was not possible before, or if it was possible, that you were not conscious of before. And you were not conscious of it before because you were not facing the imminent death of the one that you love. Because of the possibility of death, the immediate possibility of such a permanent separation, such a final separation, each touch becomes significant. So, even in a universe, in a parallel world, where perhaps shaving might be considered incest taboo, would I have restrained myself? And I'm not talking about this as artistic representation. I'm talking about this as life. Would I, as a son, have refrained myself from shaving my father if he had asked me for it? Because that's exactly what I did in the last 3 months of his life. I shaved him. And in shaving him, I touched him like I have never touched my father before. And this is what I think we need to come to terms with when we think about the possibility of art depicting challenging situations about aging. Because what it enables you to do is to conceive the inconceivable, is to make you think the unthinkable. It is to make you finally realize what it is to love the ones that you love. And when you think about it that way, and the question of censorship becomes irrelevant. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasi. If tonight has moved you immensely, with all the rich conversations, with the generous sharing of stories, we ask that you tell someone about it. Tell someone about what happened tonight. Not to teach them something, but just to share, just to relate to another person. And on this note, thank you and good night.